The bucket hit the ground with a hollow clang that echoed off the barn walls, and Simon Crawford felt something inside his chest snap clean in two. "I am not doing it," 9-year-old Emmett announced, crossing his arms with the kind of certainty that only a child who had survived real grief could muster. "Papa never made us explain why. We just did it because we had to." Beside him, 7-year-old Colt stood rigid, his jaw set in an imitation of his older brother's defiance, even though his lower lip trembled at the edges. And little 5-year-old Jasper, round-cheeked and wide-eyed, looked between his brothers and the tall woman standing in the middle of their barn with dirt on her traveling dress and exhaustion carved into the fine bones of her face, and he simply sat down in the straw and refused to move. Delia Brenner had been in Coldwater Creek for exactly 4 hours. She had not unpacked her single trunk. She had not eaten since dawn. She had ridden 30 miles on a buckboard with a driver who smelled like old tobacco, and said nothing except to warn her that the Crawford place was a particular kind of hard since the missus passed. She had arrived to find 3 boys staring at her from the porch like she was either a ghost or an enemy, and she had not yet determined which they thought she was. And now this. The chores were simple. She had seen the list Simon had written out in precise, careful handwriting and left pinned to the kitchen door before he rode out to the eastern pasture at first light, trusting that she could manage the morning routine with the boys while he worked. Feed the chickens, collect the eggs, haul water from the well to the trough, muck out the stall where the bay mare had foaled 3 nights ago. Simple, necessary, survival-level tasks. None of the 3 boys had moved to do a single one of them. Delia looked at Emmett, at the hard set of his mouth and the grief underneath it that he was too young to name but old enough to weaponize. She looked at Colt, who was borrowing his brother's fury because he did not yet know what his own was shaped like. She looked at little Jasper, sitting in the straw with hay in his dark hair, and an expression of profound exhaustion that no 5-year-old should own. And Delia Brenner, who had survived things that would have broken harder women, felt the weight of the moment pressed down on her like a hand between her shoulder blades. She could have insisted. She could have been firm in the way the letter from the agency had suggested she be firm, establishing routine and authority from the first hour. She could have told them that their father had hired her, and what their father said went, and that was the end of the matter. Instead, she sat down in the straw beside Jasper. She arranged her skirt. She looked up at the 2 older boys who stared at her as if she had just done something dangerous. She said in a voice that was quieter than they expected, "Would you like to know why the water matters?" The silence in that barn was enormous. And then, very slowly, Emmett Crawford uncrossed his arms. It had started, as so many things in 1883 started in the territory of New Mexico, with a letter. Simon Crawford was 34 years old, and he was drowning in plain sight. Not in any dramatic fashion that people could rally around or name, but in the slow, suffocating way that a good man drowns when he has too much land and too many animals and 3 children under 10, and not enough hours in the day and grief that lives in the walls of his house like a second occupant. His wife, Margaret, had died 16 months before of a fever that took her in 3 days, and left him standing at her grave in the October wind, wondering how a world that had seemed so manageable had suddenly become this vast and impossible thing. He had tried. God knows he had tried. He had hired a woman from town, Mrs. Hensley, who was efficient and cold, and made the boys feel like guests in their own kitchen. He had tried doing everything himself and nearly run his health into the ground by February. He had asked his sister in Albuquerque, who had 5 children of her own and could not come. He had even, in a moment of desperation, asked old Clyde Marsh, who ran the general store, if he knew of any woman in the county who might help, and Clyde had given him a look that mixed pity and practicality in equal measure and said, "There are agencies for men in your situation, Simon." He had put it off for 4 months after that. It had felt like a betrayal, though he could not have said precisely of whom or of what. Of Margaret, maybe. of some idea he had carried since boyhood that a man solved his own problems and provided for his own family, and did not need to send away for help like ordering a new harness or a set of plow blades. But then Colt had gotten sick in March, a chest cold that became something worse, and Simon had been awake for 6 nights straight trying to work the ranch and tend the boy and keep Emmett from taking on responsibilities that would have aged him a decade overnight. And Jasper had stood in the kitchen doorway one morning and said, in that careful way he had, "Papa, I forgot how to make the biscuits. Mama used to make them." And Simon had looked at his youngest son and felt the floor go out from under him. He wrote to the agency 2 days later. The Territorial Women's Placement Agency in Santa Fe handled requests from ranchers, miners, and settlers throughout New Mexico Territory and parts of Texas and Colorado. Their letters were businesslike and measured, explaining the terms of arrangement, the expectations of propriety, the trial period of 60 days, and the conditions under which a placement could be terminated by either party. Simon read the letter 3 times. He wrote back. They sent him a profile. Delia Brenner, age 28, born in Missouri, educated at a seminary school in Kansas City through age 16, experienced in household management, child care, cooking, and basic farming. Previously employed as a schoolteacher in Dodge City for 3 years. References provided. Traveling independently as of April 1883. There had been other profiles. Simon had read them all and felt nothing particular, but something about the brief, unadorned language of Delia Brenner's summary had caught him. Most of the women's profiles had small rhetorical flourishes, small efforts to present themselves attractively. Delia Brenner's said exactly what it meant and nothing more. He found that he respected it. He wrote to her directly, explaining the situation with the same economy she had used. 3 boys, aged 9, 7, and 5. 800 acres in the high desert near Coldwater Creek, good water, good soil, a working ranch with horses and cattle and chickens. The house was sound. The work was considerable. He would provide room, board, and a wage of $12 a month. He would expect competence and patience. He offered no promises beyond that. Her reply came in 10 days. Mr. Crawford, I accept your terms. I will arrive by the 15th of June if the stage from Santa Fe connects as scheduled. I should tell you clearly that I am not coming to be a ghost of what you've lost. I intend to be useful in my own way, on my own terms, or not at all. I believe that is better said now than discovered later. Respectfully, Delia Brenner. Simon had read that letter 4 times. Then he had folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his coat where Margaret's last letter to him had lived for 16 months, and he had stood at the kitchen window looking out at the empty yard and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not hope, exactly, but the distant cousin of it. The 15th of June came with the kind of heat that lived in the bones of New Mexico Territory, the kind that made the air shimmer above the flat hardpan and turned the sage a dusty silver. Simon had intended to meet her at the stage stop in town. He had been up at 4 in the morning to get the early work done, had put on his better shirt, had even made the boys wash their faces and comb their hair, which Emmett had accepted with deep resignation, and Colt with vocal protest, and Jasper with the eerie compliance of a child who was genuinely trying to understand what was happening. Then the bay mare, who had been close to foaling for a week, had gone into labor at 7 in the morning with complications, and Simon had spent the next 5 hours in the barn with his hands and his prayers, and eventually a healthy foal that cost him the trip to town. He had sent word with his neighbor, old Pete Haverford, asking Pete to explain the situation to Miss Brenner and bring her out to the ranch. Pete had done this, evidently with minimal conversation, because when the buckboard appeared at the gate at 3 in the afternoon, Delia Brenner stepped down from it with the self-contained composure of someone who had decided not to take the slight personally and had put it away. Simon met her at the gate. He was still in the shirt he had put on that morning, But there was dried blood on his forearm from the foaling and straw in his hair, and he had forgotten entirely that he had meant to look presentable. She was not what he had constructed in his mind. He had built up some vague impression of a capable, sensible woman, plain-featured and efficient. Delia Brenner was not plain. She was not soft either, not in the way that word sometimes implied. She was tall for a woman, with dark auburn hair pinned back under a traveling hat that had seen better days, and her face had a quality that he would spend weeks trying to name before settling on the word watchful. Her eyes were gray-green, the color of sage after rain. She looked at him the way she had written to him, directly, without performance, without the social flutter that most women employed when meeting a new and potentially significant man. She looked at the blood on his forearm and the straw in his hair and said, "The foal came safely." "Yes," he said, "both mare and foal are well. I apologize for not meeting you in town." "The foal mattered more," she said simply. "Is it a colt?" "Filly, black as pitch." Something moved in her eyes that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Good. Shall I meet the boys?" The boys had come to stand at the porch railing in a row, and Simon watched Delia Brenner look at his 3 sons with an attention that was serious and specific. Not the quick, categorizing look of someone assessing a problem, but the long, careful look of someone who was actually seeing. Emmett, straight-backed and suspicious. Colt, vibrating with contained energy. Jasper, gripping the railing with both small hands. "Hello," she said, walking toward the porch. Emmett said nothing. Colt said, "You're going to be our new housekeeper," in a tone that made the word housekeeper sound like an accusation. "I am going to help your father," Delia said, and her voice was neither defensive nor apologetic. "What's your name?" "Colt Crawford." "Named for the revolver or the horse?" Colt blinked, startled out of his hostility. "The horse," he admitted. "Good answer," she said. "And you?" She looked at Emmett. "Emmett." And the small one, Jasper, who had been watching her with enormous brown eyes, whispered, "Jasper." "3 fine names," she said. "I am Delia Brenner. You may call me Miss Delia if you like, or you may call me Miss Brenner, but you may not call me ma'am because I am not yet old enough for that, and I intend to fight it for another decade at minimum." Colt made a sound that was almost a laugh before he caught himself. Simon Crawford stood at the bottom of the porch steps and watched Delia Brenner make the first small crack in 3 boys' defenses with a single sentence about the word ma'am, and he felt the distant cousin of hope move a little closer. The first 2 weeks were hard. Not catastrophically, not in ways that broke anything, but in the grinding, daily way that adjustment is always hard when what is being adjusted is made of human beings with their own histories and wounds and secret rules. Delia learned the kitchen in the first 3 days, cataloging what was stored where with the methodical precision of someone who understood that a well-organized kitchen was not about tidiness but about survival. She cooked competently, not with flair but with consistency, and food appeared on the table at predictable times, which Simon understood was a more profound gift than it sounded because predictability was something grief had stolen from his household. She did not try to be Margaret. He had dreaded this more than he had named it, the possibility that someone would come into this house and perform the role of mother, filling in the outline that the boys had of someone they had loved. Delia did not do this. She was entirely herself, and herself was brisk and curious and occasionally surprising. She had strong opinions about which way a harness strap should be threaded and was not shy about saying so. She read in the evenings from books she had carried in her trunk, and when Emmett crept close enough to see what the books were, she would tell him without looking up exactly what page she was on and invite him to start at the beginning. The chores were the battle. Every morning, every evening, the same resistance. Simon had established the routine before Delia arrived. Emmett fed and watered the chickens, collected the eggs, and helped check the fence line near the north pasture. Colt hauled water from the well to the stock trough and swept the barn. Jasper gathered the eggs with Emmett and cleared the table after meals. These were not unreasonable assignments for boys their age on a working ranch. Simon's own father had given him more responsibility at younger ages, and he had turned out intact. But the boys did the chores with a sullen, dragging reluctance that wore on everyone. They did not refuse exactly. They had learned that refusal had consequences. But they did them slowly, badly, with an air of profound injustice that made each morning feel like wading through mud. Simon had tried explaining that the ranch depended on these tasks. He had tried patience. He had tried, once, a sharpness of tone that he immediately regretted because Jasper's eyes had filled with tears and Simon had spent an hour afterward feeling like a villain. And then, on the morning of the 15th day, Delia went to the barn. Jasper had sat down in the straw and refused to move. Emmett had dropped the bucket. The whole fragile structure of the morning had tilted toward collapse, and Delia sat down in the straw beside Jasper. "Would you like to know," she said, "why the water matters?" Emmett stared at her. He had expected a lecture. He had expected the voice of adult authority marshaling its forces. He had not expected her to sit down. "What do you mean?" he said with a suspicion that was also underneath genuine curiosity. "The water in the trough," Delia said. She was looking at Colt now, who was supposed to haul it. "Colt hauls the water. I'd like to tell you why that particular chore is the most important one on this ranch, but you need to sit down for me to explain it properly." Colt looked at Emmett. Emmett looked back. Some negotiation passed between them that used no words. Then Colt sat down on a nearby hay bale with the air of someone making a significant concession. Emmett sat on a fence rail and crossed his arms, but he sat. Delia looked at Jasper beside her and said, "Are you comfortable?" Jasper nodded very seriously. "Good," she said. "Now, the trough. Your father has a bay mare and a new foal in this stall." She gestured at the stall where the black filly had been standing on uncertain legs for 2 weeks, growing more sure by the day. A mare feeding a foal needs an enormous amount of water, more than you might guess. In this heat, in June in New Mexico territory, she can drink up to 15 gallons a day. If she doesn't get it, her milk comes in thin and weak and the foal doesn't grow right. Colt's eyes had moved, despite himself, to the filly. "Your father spent 5 hours on the morning I arrived making sure that filly was born alive," Delia continued, her voice level and unhurried. "He was up to his elbows in a very difficult situation because your mare needed help, and he did not stop until the job was done. That filly is alive because of what he did that morning." A pause. The filly was nosing at her mother's side, and the 3 boys were watching her with an attention that had replaced, for the moment, the manufactured indifference they had arrived with. "When you haul the water, Colt, you are the last part of what keeps that filly alive. Your father did his part on the day she was born. You do your part every morning. Do you understand what I mean?" Colt was quiet for a moment. Then he said in a voice that was smaller than his usual one, "It's connected." "Everything on a ranch is connected," Delia said. "That is the secret that nobody explains. You are told to do chores because they need doing. But what they don't say is that every chore is a link in a chain, and if any link breaks, something that you care about gets hurt." She let that settle. Outside, a rooster was performing his belated morning opinion. The filly made a small, soft sound. "Would you like to hear about the chickens?" Delia said, looking at Emmett. Emmett uncrossed his arms. That morning, Delia Brenner sat in the straw of Simon Crawford's barn and told his 3 sons the story behind every chore they had been dreading. Not the obvious story, not the version that adults usually gave, which was essentially an argument about the abstract importance of responsibility. She told them the specific, living story of what each task touched and who depended on it, and what would happen if it was not done, told in language that connected the task to something they could already feel, something they already cared about. The chickens needed feeding before 8 in the morning because in the heat of the day, hens that were hungry and agitated laid fewer eggs, and fewer eggs meant no breakfast for anyone, including themselves. Collecting the eggs daily meant none broke and rotted in the nest, which kept the hens from developing the dangerous habit of eating their own eggs, which was a habit that once started almost never stopped and would mean the end of any eggs at all. Checking the fence near the north pasture mattered because 3 days ago a coyote had tested a weak spot that Emmett had almost certainly walked past twice without noticing, and the sheep in the north pasture had lambs, and if the coyote got through, those lambs would not survive it. She did not moralize. She did not say, and this is why you should feel grateful for the opportunity to do chores. She told them the story, and she let the story do what stories do, which is to make a person feel that they are part of something larger than themselves, something that is alive and depends on them. By the time Simon Crawford returned from the eastern pasture at mid-morning, the trough was full. The eggs had been collected, the barn had been mucked out, the chickens were fed. He stood in the yard and looked at these facts and felt that he was missing some essential information. He found Delia in the kitchen, rolling out dough with the economical, practiced motions of someone who had done it 10,000 times. Jasper was sitting on a stool at the table, watching her with the focused attention he reserved for things that interested him deeply. "The chores are done," Simon said. "Yes," she said. He waited for more. She did not offer it. He said, "How?" She looked up at him. Those gray-green eyes had a quality in them that he was beginning to recognize, the quality of someone who was deciding how much to say. "I told them why," she said. "The story behind why each chore matters, not the rule, the reason." Simon looked at Jasper, who looked back at him with the expression of someone recently initiated into a significant secret. "The filly," Jasper said importantly. "The water is for the filly." Simon looked back at Delia. She was already looking back down at her dough. He could not have said what he felt in that moment precisely. He was not a man who had the habit of cataloging his interior states in words. But something in his chest, in the region of the old wound, did something he had not felt it do in a very long time. It softened. He had told himself, in the careful, practical letters he had exchanged with the agency and with Delia herself, that he was looking for competence and patience. He was a sensible man who understood his situation clearly. He needed help. He was hiring help. He was not looking for anything else, and he was particularly not looking for anything that would complicate the arrangement, or give his boys false expectations, or disturb the fragile equilibrium that he had, at great cost, constructed in the 16 months since Margaret died. He had told himself this so thoroughly and so often that he had almost come to believe it was the whole truth. The problem with Delia Brenner was that she made it very difficult to believe in the whole truth of simple, practical arrangements. She was practical, absolutely. She was competent in ways that went beyond what her agency profile had suggested. She understood horses better than most women he had met, better than some men, and could assess a lame horse's gait with an authority that the boys found impressive, and that Simon found unexpectedly interesting to watch. She managed the household not just adequately but well, making small improvements to systems that had been working poorly for months without calling attention to what she was doing. The kitchen ran better. The supply management was more efficient. Small repairs that had been waiting accumulated attention got attention. But she was also, beneath the practicality, something more than practical. She read Emmett's silences the way you read weather, and she knew when to approach and when to give him sky. She found Colt's particular language, which was physical and kinetic and full of questions about how things worked, and she spoke it back to him with a fluency that seemed intuitive. She understood that Jasper needed the world explained in stories, that he was a child who constructed his understanding of things through narrative rather than rule, and she gave him stories the way you give water to a thirsty thing, freely and without making him ask twice. Simon watched all of this and said almost nothing about it, because he did not have the language for it yet, and because he was afraid of what naming it might mean. It was Emmett who broke the careful distance first. It happened on a Tuesday evening in early July, when the heat was still brutal at sundown, and the air smelled of hot stone and distant rain that wouldn't come. Simon was on the porch with his pipe. Delia was inside. Emmett came and sat beside his father in the other chair, which was unusual because Emmett had spent most of his grief turning away from company. "Papa," Emmett said, Is Miss Delia going to stay? Simon looked at his oldest son. The 60-day trial period was in its 5th week. He had not thought past it in any concrete way, which was itself a kind of thinking. That depends, he said carefully, on whether she wants to and whether the arrangement suits everyone. Emmett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She told me today that the reason I check the fence matters is because of the sheep, and then she told me the names of the 3 lambs." Simon waited. "I didn't know they had names," Emmett said. "She named them. She named them after things she said reminded her of good things, so that when I checked the fence I would be checking on something that had a name and not just a thing." He paused. "She said Mama probably named things too, because that is what people do when they love something." Simon felt the familiar weight move through him, the grief that was never entirely gone, only sometimes quieter. "Your mother named everything," he said. "The first milk cow was called Petunia. She named the water barrel." Emmett almost smiled. "She did. She called it Gerald." This time Emmett actually smiled briefly, like a sun going behind a cloud and coming back out. "Papa," he said, "I think Miss Delia is good." Simon said, "I think you might be right." He went inside that evening after the boys were in bed and found Delia still at the kitchen table, writing by the light of a kerosene lamp. She had letters she wrote occasionally, he had noticed, letters she sealed carefully and did not discuss. He had respected this the way he hoped she respected his own private territories. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot that was still warm on the stove and set one beside her elbow without asking. She looked up, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "Emmett spoke to me tonight," he said, "about the lambs." Her expression did not change dramatically, but something in it settled, the way a held breath settles into an exhale. "He's carrying a great deal," she said. "He's trying to be the oldest, which means he's trying to understand why everything happened. Children who need reasons often grow into people who find them, or who make them." Simon sat down across from her. The lamp made the kitchen feel smaller, the circle of light containing them both in something that felt almost like privacy. "Where did you learn to do what you do with them?" he said. "The stories, the reasons." She was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup between her hands. "My father," she said finally. "He was a good man, but he was not expressive. He didn't know how to tell me he loved me in words, but he explained things. He explained why the preserving had to happen in August and not September, what would happen to the food stores if we waited. He explained why we planted the kitchen garden in a particular order, what each plant needed from the one beside it." She paused. "When I was grown, I realized that every explanation had been a conversation he didn't know how to have any other way. He was telling me the world mattered and I was in it." Simon listened to this very carefully. He had the feeling he often had around Delia Brenner of receiving more than had been said. "What happened to him?" he asked. "He died when I was 22, she said. "My mother had gone when I was 9. I was the last of 3 girls. The other 2 married and moved east. I stayed on the farm until I couldn't keep it." She said this without self-pity, in the straightforward way she said most things. "I taught school in Dodge City for 3 years after." "You left teaching to come here," he said. "I left Dodge City," she said. "It's not the same thing." He watched her face, the careful quality of it, the way she kept certain doors closed without being cold about it. He understood there was a hidden history here, something she had not written in her agency profile, something the sealed letters might be connected to. He did not press. He had his own sealed rooms. But that night, after she had gone to bed and he sat alone on the porch with the last of the July heat radiating off the ground and the stars enormous above the mesa, Simon Crawford thought about a woman who had stayed on a failing farm until she couldn't, who had taught school in a cattle town, who had come to a desert ranch with a single trunk and 3 hostile boys, and sat down in the straw without blinking. He thought about what it took to do what she did, the courage underneath the practicality, the will that powered the competence, the particular quality of someone who showed up entirely as themselves and asked nothing in return but to be useful. He thought about it for a long time. He thought about how the quality of his days had changed since she arrived, How the house felt inhabited rather than merely occupied. How the boys were slowly, haltingly, beginning to reanimate in ways that they had not in 16 months. How Jasper had laughed 3 times last week, real laughing, full and unguarded, the kind Simon had been afraid he might have forgotten how to do. He thought about a particular evening 2 weeks ago when there had been a thunderstorm rolling in from the west, the sky going that specific dark gold that preceded the serious storms, and he had come around the corner of the house to find Delia standing in the yard with her hair down from its pins, which he had never seen before, watching the lightning over the mesa with an expression of open wonder that she had not known he was close enough to see. She had turned when she heard him, and for one unguarded second her face had been entirely open, and what he had seen in it had struck him somewhere deep and involuntary. He had said, "Beautiful storm," looking at the sky. She had said, "Yes," in a voice that suggested she was already putting her expression away. He had stood beside her in the yard and they had watched the lightning come closer together, saying nothing else, for perhaps 10 minutes. The storm had bypassed them, rolling south. She had gone inside. He had stood in the yard alone for a long time afterward. Now he sat on the porch in the July dark and understood, with the clarity that only solitude and late hours can produce, that his problem was no longer primarily about chores or ranch management or even his boys. His problem was Delia Brenner. Or rather, the problem was that he was beginning to feel things about Delia Brenner that had no place in a careful, practical employment arrangement, and he did not know what to do about them. In August, Delia's past arrived. It came in the form of a man named Raymond Holt, who rode onto the Crawford property on a Wednesday afternoon when Simon was in the north pasture, and Delia was hanging washing on the line with the boys passing her clothespins. Delia saw him come through the gate and went very still in a way that the boys noticed, because boys always notice the things that adults suddenly make silent. Emmett said, "Miss Delia, do you know that man?" "Yes," she said. "Go inside and stay there, please. All 3 of you." Her voice had a quality they had not heard before, something underneath the usual steadiness, and the 3 boys went without argument. Raymond Holt was 36, well-dressed in the way that men who had money but no particular taste were well-dressed, and he had the face of someone who was accustomed to getting what he wanted and had constructed an attitude of casual authority around that expectation. He stopped his horse 10 feet from Delia and looked at her with an expression that mixed possessiveness and resentment in equal and ugly parts. "Found you," he said. "You were not looking for me," Delia said. "You were looking for leverage. You took something of mine when you left Dodge City." "I took my own wages, which you had not paid for 3 months," she said, "and I took the documents that proved I was owed them, because I knew you would rewrite history the moment I was gone." Simon Crawford, who had seen an unfamiliar horse at the gate from the far side of the pasture, had come in at a pace that was not quite running but was considerably faster than walking. He came around the corner of the house and took in the scene, Delia, pale but composed, standing at the clothesline, a well-dressed stranger on horseback regarding her with ownership written all over him. Simon stopped beside Delia. He did not make a production of it, he simply stood there. Raymond Holt looked at him. "This the man you've attached yourself to?" "Mr. Holt," Delia said. "You will address me, not him." "Miss Brenner was in my employ in Dodge City," Raymond said, switching his address to Simon with the air of someone who believed men handled business with men. "She left with certain items that belonged to me, including financial records from my business." "The financial records document what he owed me," Delia said to Simon, evenly, without looking away from Holt. "He owns 2 rooming houses in Dodge City. He employed me to manage the second one. He did not pay me for 3 months and then attempted to remove the record of the debt by claiming I had stolen from him rather than the reverse. I left before he could have me arrested for a crime I did not commit. I took the documents that proved my wages were owed." Simon looked at her for 1 second. Then he looked at Raymond Holt. "It sounds to me like you're owed an apology and some back wages," he said in the mild, direct way that in Simon Crawford's voice carried enormous weight. And like this man has a long way to go home, Holt's expression tightened. He was not a physical threat. Simon could read that. He was the kind of man who wielded lawyers and social mechanics rather than his fists. But he was a threat of a different kind, the kind that operated through reputation and accusation and the machinery of male authority in a territory where women had very little legal recourse. "There's a marshal in Coldwater Creek," Holt said. "I know the marshal," Simon said. "We can all three go to him right now if you like, and Miss Brenner can present her documentation and you can present yours, and Marshal Greer can sort it out." He said this pleasantly, without hostility, because he did not need hostility. "Or you can turn your horse around and go back to Dodge City and decide that the cost of pursuing this is higher than whatever you think you're owed." A long moment passed. The washing moved in the dry afternoon wind. One of the hens complained about something in the yard. Raymond Holt looked at Delia one more time. "You made an enemy today that you didn't need," he said. "I had one already," she said. "This is not new information." He turned his horse and rode back through the gate. Delia stood perfectly still until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Then she sat down very carefully on the wooden bench near the clothesline, and Simon saw what the composed exterior had cost her, because her hands were trembling slightly against her lap. He sat down beside her, not close but close enough. "How long?" he said. "2 years," she said. "He was making it impossible for me to find other work in Dodge City by circulating a story about missing money. The placement agency was how I got outside his reach. He couldn't follow me into the territory placements without revealing that he'd been specifically targeting me." Simon said, "The documents, are they safe?" "Locked in my trunk," she said. "I have copies at a lawyer's office in Santa Fe." He nodded slowly. "You were protecting yourself." "Every step of the way," she said. "I should have told you when I arrived. I'm sorry for the dark past that followed me here. That was not fair to you or your boys." Simon looked out at the gate through which Raymond Holt had disappeared. "You told me in your first letter that you intended to be useful on your own terms or not at all," he said. "I took that seriously. I still do." She looked at him then, and he was unprepared, as he was sometimes unprepared, for the directness of her gaze, the way it asked nothing but missed nothing either. "You stood there," she said. "You didn't ask me to explain myself to him. You just stood there." "It wasn't my story to tell," he said. She turned to look at the gate again, and he saw her face doing the thing it sometimes did when she was putting something carefully away. But this time, before it was fully away, he caught the expression underneath, and what he saw in it was something he recognized because he had been carrying it himself. She was lonely. Not the ordinary loneliness of solitude, but the deeper kind, the kind that comes from being entirely capable and entirely alone with it for a long time. He understood that particular terrain better than he could say. He was about to speak, to say something that he had not prepared and did not know the shape of yet, when the kitchen door banged open and Colt appeared at the top of the porch steps with an expression of bursting importance. "He's gone," Colt announced. "We watched from the window. Emmett said we should know in case he came back." "He won't come back," Simon said. "Come here." Colt came down the steps. Emmett appeared behind him, and Jasper behind Emmett, and the 3 boys stood before their father and Delia with the particular alert attention of children who have sensed something significant and are deciding how to feel about it. "Miss Delia was managing a difficult situation," Simon said. "She handled it well. It's finished." Jasper looked at Delia with his enormous brown eyes. "Were you scared?" he asked. Delia considered this honestly, which was one of the things about her. She did not offer children false comfort or condescension. "A little," she said, "but being scared and being able to handle something are not mutually exclusive. You can be both at once." "Like when the coyote got near the fence," Jasper said, "and I was scared but I still told you about it." "Exactly like that," she said. Jasper nodded, satisfied. "Good," he said. That night after supper, after the boys were in bed, Delia was reading at the kitchen table, and Simon brought his chair close to the lamp because the accounts book needed doing, and this was as good a place as any. They sat in the lamplight for an hour in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that has stopped being awkward because both people in it have accepted the other's presence as something that is simply there, like the table or the lamp or the sound of the wind outside. At some point, Delia turned a page, and as she did, her hand rested for a moment on the edge of the table near his, not touching but near, and Simon did not move his hand away. They did not look at each other. But they both, he was quite certain, noticed. September arrived, and with it the end of the 60-day trial period. Simon had not mentioned it. He was not sure if she had been counting. He had found, over the course of the summer, that he had completely stopped thinking of the arrangement as an arrangement, which was either the most natural thing in the world or a significant problem, depending on how you approached it. He approached it, finally, on a Sunday morning when the boys had gone to help old Pete Haverford with a fence repair. A thing Pete had engineered somewhat transparently, Simon suspected, because Pete was 72 years old and a romantic of the frontier variety who had expressed opinions about that capable woman at the Crawford place, with less subtlety than he imagined. Simon found Delia in the kitchen garden, where she had been, over the summer, systematically improving what had been a sad and neglected patch of ground into something that was now producing actual food. She was kneeling between the tomato stakes, checking the fruit, and she looked up when she heard him. "The trial period ended 2 days ago," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I know. I want you to stay," he said. "Not on the agency's terms. I want to offer you something different." He paused because he had prepared this speech with some care, but it was not behaving. "I want to offer you a permanent position, better wage, more defined terms." He stopped. "That's not entirely honest." She waited. "I want to offer you a permanent position," he said again. "And I am aware that what I actually want is complicated by the fact that I have spent the last 2 months becoming very attached to your presence in a way that goes beyond employment. And I think you should know that because you deserve to make this decision with honest information." The morning light was doing things to her hair that he tried not to notice. She was still kneeling between the tomato stakes. Her expression was doing the careful thing, but he could see underneath it something that was working hard. "Simon," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the Mr. in front of it. "Delia," he said. "I have been writing letters," she said, "that I have not explained to you." "I noticed," he said. "They are to my sister, the elder one, Clara, who lives in Cincinnati. I have been telling her about this place, about the ranch and the boys, and," she paused, "about you, more about you than perhaps I intended." He felt something warm move through him that he tried to manage and could not entirely. "What does Clara say?" he asked. "She says that I have never in 28 years described a person the way I describe you," Delia said, with the clinical precision of someone reporting a thing rather than performing it. "And that she doesn't know what I'm waiting for." "What are you waiting for?" he said. The pause this time was long enough that a mockingbird in the cottonwood started up his catalog and went through several songs. Delia was looking at him with the watchful, considering look that he had been learning to read all summer, and he waited because he had learned that she was worth waiting for. "I have been self-sufficient for a very long time," she said. "Not by preference exactly, by necessity. And I have been very careful not to need things I couldn't provide for myself, because the cost of needing something you can't guarantee is a particular kind of pain I know too well." He understood this in his body, not just his mind. "I know that kind," he said. "But I have also," she said, and her voice was quieter now, "been sitting in your kitchen in the evenings and been happier than I have been in years, and I find that dishonest to pretend is simply professional satisfaction." Simon Crawford crossed the kitchen garden in 4 steps, which brought him close enough that he could see the exact color of her eyes in the morning light, that gray-green he had been trying to describe to himself for months. He extended his hand to help her up from kneeling, and when she took it and stood, he did not immediately let go. She looked up at him close now, with that watchful face open in a way he had only caught glimpses of before. "I am not good at this," he said. "I haven't had to be for a long time. I will likely be slow and I will likely say the wrong thing at intervals." "I have a reasonably high tolerance for intervals," she said. "Then I would very much like to court you," he said. "If you are willing, not as an arrangement, as a man who finds himself unable to imagine you leaving." Her free hand came up briefly and touched the front of his shirt, not dramatically, not with grand sentiment, just the simple, specific gesture of someone choosing to close a distance. "I'm not leaving," she said. The autumn was the most extraordinary season Simon Crawford could remember in a long time, and he had lived on this land for 12 years. It was extraordinary not because of anything dramatic, but because of the accumulation of quiet things, the way ordinary days could be entirely transformed by the presence of someone who made you feel that ordinary days were enough. He courted Delia in the way available to a man with 3 sons and a working ranch, which was to say imperfectly and without elegance. He found, over supper on a Tuesday, that she had a specific and detailed interest in the geology of the Mesa country, having read several pamphlets published by the Smithsonian Institution, and he took her, the following Sunday, to a ridge on the eastern edge of the property where the rock formations were genuinely strange and beautiful, and they stood there for 2 hours while she told him what she knew and he listened and felt again. The specific pleasure of being in the company of someone who was entirely themselves. He told her, on a September evening while they were mending harness on the porch, about Margaret. Not in the way of someone laying out a wound, but in the way of someone choosing to share something that mattered. He told her that Margaret had been kind in a way that was specific and practical, that she had loved this land fiercely, that she had died angry because she was not finished, and that the anger had seemed to him absolutely right, and he had found it more comforting than the soft theology people offered at funerals. Delia listened without filling the silence, which was the correct response and rarer than it should have been. She told him in return about her years in Dodge City and what they had taken from her. She had arrived there at 23, eager and capable and genuinely idealistic about teaching, and the reality of a cattle town school had been, in many ways, good. But Dodge City in 1879 and 1880 was also a place where the violence of the frontier was being conducted at high volume very close to ordinary life, and the institution of Raymond Holt's second rooming house had been a particular kind of trap for a woman who needed income and didn't yet fully understand how men like Raymond Holt operated. She had worked for him for a year and a half, managing the building competently, and the trap had been slow, the way the best traps always were, a quiet accumulation of obligation and implied gratitude until she was effectively dependent on his goodwill for her professional reputation. "I should have left sooner," she said. "You left when you could," he said. "I am telling you this," she said, "because I need you to understand that I chose this very deliberately. I chose you and your boys and this ranch and this life because I looked at it clearly and wanted it, not because I was trapped into it or because you were the available option. I need that to be known." "It is known," he said. The boys were watching all of this with varying degrees of sophistication. Emmett was 9 years old and possessed of a seriousness that comprehended more than most children his age, and he observed his father and Delia with a careful attention that was more accepting than Simon had expected, as if he had been processing something over the summer and had arrived at a conclusion. He did not say much about it directly, but one evening, unsolicited, he told Simon that he thought Miss Delia was the kind of person who stays, and Simon had held those words in his chest for days. Colt's response was characteristically operational. He began, at some point in September, treating Delia as a source of information on roughly the same authority as his father, asking her questions about mechanical things and animal behavior, and whether reading with the same directness he used with Simon. When she answered with the same directness, he was satisfied, and that, for Colt, seemed to be that. Jasper simply loved her, with the uncomplicated, full-hearted love that 5-year-olds extend to the people who explain the world in stories. He had begun with her encouragement, telling his own stories, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings and narrating events from the day in a language that mixed real observation with invented significance. And Delia listened to all of them with the specific, serious attention that stories deserve. In October, Simon asked Delia to marry him. He did it on the porch in the last of the afternoon light, without a ring because a ring was something he would take her to Santa Fe to choose properly, and without a speech because he had tried to write one, and it had not been honest enough to say out loud. He had found her there after supper, watching the sunset do what sunsets in New Mexico did, which was to turn the entire sky into something unreasonably extravagant, and he had sat beside her and said simply, "I want to ask you something." She had looked at him with the watchful eyes that were not actually watchful, he had learned, but attentive. There was a difference. "Yes," he said, "I haven't asked yet." "I know," she said, "but I'm already answering." And that was that. They were married in November, in the parlor of the ranch house, by the Methodist minister who came to Coldwater Creek twice a month. There were exactly 12 people present. Simon and Delia, the 3 boys, old Pete Haverford and his wife, the marshal and his wife, the woman who ran the millinery in town who had become friendly with Delia over the summer and whose name was Grace, the doctor who had treated Colt's chest cold in the spring and his wife, and the minister. Delia wore a dress that she had made herself from fabric she ordered from Santa Fe, a dark green wool appropriate to November that brought out the color of her eyes. Simon wore his good coat and did not have straw in his hair. Emmett, who had been asked to serve as witness, signed his name on the document with the careful handwriting of someone who understood the weight of what he was signing. Colt cried, which surprised everyone including Colt, who looked subsequently furious with himself about it. Jasper sat in the front row, and at the moment Simon put the ring on Delia's finger, which was silver from Santa Fe with a small piece of turquoise in it, Jasper said, not loudly but clearly, "It fits." He meant the ring. Simon was not entirely sure he did not mean something else. They stood together in the parlor of the ranch house in November 1883, and Simon Crawford took Delia Brenner's hands in his and made her his wife, and the world outside the windows was cold and the sky was the deep blue of winter coming, and the house was warm. The winter that followed was cold and close and good. Simon discovered, in the intimacy of marriage, dimensions of Delia that even the summer's careful learning had not revealed. She was a light sleeper who woke before him and was often already at the stove when he came down in the pre-dawn dark. And this, inexplicably, was one of the things about her that most consistently moved him. She was not sentimental in the ordinary ways but was specific in her tenderness, making no general declarations but noticing precisely. The way she put an extra log on the fire when he came in from riding without him asking. The way she remembered that Emmett's cold came first on in his throat and kept the honey close in November. The way she found Jasper's second boot when he lost it with a thoroughness that suggested she had been paying attention to where Jasper lost things long before it became a practical problem. She was also, in the privacy of their marriage, more open than the composed exterior had suggested. She talked more, in the evenings when it was just the two of them, and the lamp was low, talked about things she thought about, ideas the pamphlets raised, memories from Missouri, a particular conversation she had once had with a woman she met on the stage to Dodge City who had changed the way she thought about something. She asked him things too, genuine questions about his opinions and his history, and she listened to his answers with the same attention she gave the boys' stories, specific and real. He found that he could say things to her that he had not said to anyone since Margaret, and different things than he had said to Margaret, because Delia was a different person and drew different things out of him. He had not expected this. He had expected, if he were honest with himself, something quieter, a restored equilibrium, a functional household and a companionable arrangement. He had not expected to fall in love. He recognized the distinction. He had loved Margaret from the inside of a long and growing intimacy, had grown into it the way a plant grows toward light, gradually and pervasively. What he felt for Delia had a different quality, sharper in places, more deliberate, a thing he had watched himself arrive at with enough distance to understand what it was. He told her on a night in December when the boys were asleep, and the ranch was locked in the particular silence of hard winter, the kind of silence that makes the world feel very small and the indoors very necessary. He said it without preamble, which was his way, directly and without decoration. He said, "I love you." She was quiet for long enough that he felt the familiar unease of having said too much, though he was fairly certain in this case he had not. Then she said, "I know, I have known for a while. And then, I love you too, Simon. More than I expected to, more than I had made room for." He took her hand in the December kitchen and held it, and outside the wind moved over the mesa and the stars were extraordinary, and his house was full of sleeping children and warmth. The chores, since the morning in the barn when Delia had first sat down in the straw and told the stories, had changed fundamentally. It had not been a single morning's transformation, but the morning had been the turning point, the hinge on which everything swung. Emmett checked the fence near the north pasture with a diligence that had become genuine rather than compelled, because he had named the lambs himself now and knew where the weak spots were, and felt the specific satisfaction of a thing well guarded. He had developed, over the autumn, a particular relationship with the sheep that combined protectiveness and affection in a way that he was too old to call by its simple name, but that his father recognized perfectly. Colt hauled the water with energy that had turned purposeful, and he had begun, on his own initiative, keeping a rough tally of the filly's growth, measuring her against a mark he made on the barn wall, tracking her progress with the methodical attention of someone who had understood the connection between his labor and her flourishing. The filly, now named Midnight by consensus of the three boys, was his particular pride, and he updated Delia on her progress with the authority of someone who had taken personal responsibility for an outcome. Jasper did his tasks with the earnestness that characterized everything he did, but more than that, he had begun inventing small stories to accompany them, narrating his egg collection as if it were an adventure, which it rather was when the more temperamental hens were involved. Delia had given him an old ledger to use as a journal, and he was filling it with a combination of drawing and phonetic writing that she was quietly helping him develop into something more structured, and he treated the ledger with the seriousness of a significant document. The chores that had been dreaded were not now loved, exactly, because chores are chores and no storytelling makes them entirely otherwise. But they were done willingly, done with understanding, done by three boys who had been told why each one mattered, and who had received in that telling something more than information. They had received the sense that what they did connected to something alive and real, that they were participants in a larger story rather than small prisoners of an arbitrary routine. Delia had understood, sitting in the straw on that first morning, that what the boys were resisting was not the work itself but the meaninglessness of it, the sense that the chores were imposed rather than joined. She had given them meaning. She had given them story, and the story had done what stories do. In February of 1884, Delia told Simon that she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen, in the morning, before the boys were up, in the same direct way she told him most things. He sat very still for a moment that she told him later seemed to last a considerable amount of time, and then he stood up from the table and put his arms around her and held her for a long time without saying anything, and she felt his heartbeat and the solidity of him, and thought that this was what it meant to have built something real. They told the boys at supper. Colt's first question was whether the baby would be a boy or a girl, and when told that there was no way to know yet, he submitted this uncertainty with philosophical resignation. Emmett asked if the baby would have its own chores when it was old enough, and when Delia said yes, certainly, he nodded with the satisfaction of someone who has seen a principle proven. Jasper asked if the baby would have a name, and when told they would decide that when the time came, he said that he had ideas if they needed them. The pregnancy went well, not easily because nothing on a working ranch in the territory of New Mexico in 1884 was easy, but well. Delia continued doing most of what she had always done with the accommodations that common sense required, and Simon was quietly attentive in the way of a man who was not performing care but actually providing it, making adjustments without making declarations, taking on extra tasks without comment, making sure there was always water warm enough, and that no one asked her to carry the heavy things. In late September, on a night when the temperature had dropped and the mesa was sharp-edged under a cold moon, Delia's labor began. Simon rode for the doctor at midnight and arrived back with him before 3 in the morning, and the doctor's wife, who came with him for exactly these occasions, took charge of the bedroom with the quiet authority of someone who had attended a great many frontier births and had very specific opinions about what was helpful and what was not. Simon was assigned to the kitchen, where he sat in the chair by the stove and listened to the sounds from the bedroom, and did the thing that men in this situation do, which is to remake every choice they have ever made and wonder if they were sufficient. The boys slept through the first part. Emmett woke sometime before dawn and came to the kitchen and sat with Simon without being asked. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "It'll be all right, Papa." Simon looked at his oldest son, at the 9-year-old who had become something older over this year without becoming anything less than himself, and felt the particular love that fathers feel when they see their children arrive at something good. "Yes," he said, "I believe it will." At 4:30 in the morning, the doctor's wife opened the bedroom door and said, "You have a son, Mr. Crawford. Both mother and boy are doing well." Emmett made a sound that he immediately tried to make dignified. Simon stood up, and his legs were unsteady, which he did not expect. He went to the bedroom door and into the room where Delia was propped against the pillows with the particular exhaustion and fierce aliveness of someone who has just done something enormous, holding a small wrapped person against her chest, and she looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with something between tears and triumph. "Hello," she said. "Hello," he said, and his voice was not particularly steady. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the small face and the small fists and the particular compact mystery of a new person, and felt the specific wonder of it that never diminishes no matter how many times in a life you encounter it. "He needs a name," Delia said. "He does," Simon said. "What did Jasper suggest?" She laughed, which was something she did more readily than she had in June, a free and genuine sound. "He suggested cottonwood after the tree by the east fence." "We will keep that in reserve," Simon said. They named him Henry after Delia's father. Simon felt this was exactly right. Colt and Jasper were brought in to meet Henry as soon as the sun was up, and Jasper looked at the baby for a long time with the serious attention he reserved for things he was working to understand, and then said, "His chores are going to be very small at first." "They will be," Delia agreed. "I'll tell him the stories," Jasper said, "so he knows why they matter." Delia looked at her youngest stepson over the head of her newborn son, and felt something so large and warm move through her that she could not have named it with any single word. The years moved in the way that good years move, which is to say quickly and with texture, each one different but each one building on the last. Henry grew from infant to toddler to small boy with the particular determination of a youngest child, dragging himself upright against chair legs and barn boards, following his brothers with a devotion that the brothers, each in their own way, returned. He was dark-haired like his mother, but had his father's wide-set eyes and a stubbornness that seemed to be original equipment rather than inherited from any specific parent. Emmett turned 10, 11, 12, growing into a young man with a quiet intelligence that Delia, who had been a teacher, recognized as the kind that needed space more than direction. She found him books where she could, ordering them from Santa Fe and occasionally from as far as Kansas City, and he read them with the focused absorption of someone who understood that books were not decoration but navigation. Colt at 12 was a force of nature properly channeled, and Midnight the filly, who became Midnight the mare, was his particular domain. He had a way with horses that went beyond what he had been taught, an instinctive reading of their attention and tension, and Simon, who was a good horseman himself, found it remarkable to watch. Jasper, at 9, had filled 2 ledger journals with his stories and drawings and was working on a third. He had a talent for narrative that went beyond childhood invention, the ability to find the animating truth in a thing and give it shape. And Delia sometimes read what he wrote and felt a particular kind of wonder at what had grown from that first morning in the barn when she had told him the story of the eggs. 3 years after Henry was born, in the early autumn of 1887, Delia told Simon about the new baby, and this time, when she said it, Simon did not sit still at all. He stood up from his chair immediately and took her face in his hands and kissed her, which made her laugh in the kitchen in the morning light in the way she laughed now, completely, without reserve. This one was a girl. They named her Margaret Rose, and Simon held his daughter on the evening she was born and did not hide the tears. And Delia watched him hold her and felt that the name was right. Not a replacement, not a ghost, but a continuation of something that had been good and was still good and would go forward. Emmett, who was 14 and had been managing the gravity of his young adult life with increasing steadiness, looked at his half-sister with an expression that broke all the way through his careful composure. The full-hearted love of a boy who had learned, over years, that love was not a finite resource and did not deplete when it was extended. Margaret Rose was a person of strong opinions from the beginning. In the spring of 1888, Raymond Holt tried one final time to reopen the question of Delia's supposed theft, writing to the territorial marshal's office with a renewed complaint. Marshal Greer, who had known the situation for 5 years and had in his possession copies of Delia's documentation that she had given him early in 1884 as a precaution, wrote back to Holt's lawyers in Dodge City with a letter that, by all accounts, was final and comprehensive. The matter was closed. Holt did not write again. Delia received the news on a Wednesday and felt, rather than relief, a quiet completion, as if a door that had been standing open in her life had finally, without drama, swung shut and latched. She told Simon that evening, and he looked at her for a moment and said, "How do you feel?" "Free," she said. "Which I thought I already was, but apparently there are degrees." He nodded. "Like how a fence that's been repaired is different from a fence that's been replaced," he said. "The repair holds, but there's always the knowledge of the old break." She looked at him with the eyes that were still gray-green and still watchful but had lost the quality of guarding something. "Yes," she said. "Exactly like that." He reached across the kitchen table and covered her hand with his. By 1889, the Crawford Ranch was operating with a competence and vitality that people in Coldwater Creek discussed as a kind of local legend, not because anything remarkable had happened there, but because the steady, accumulating quality of a place that was being cared for well was visible and admirable, and not as common as it should have been. The land was managed better than most, the stock was healthy, the fences held, and the family that occupied the ranch had a reputation in town for being solid in the way that few families were. Emmett, now 16, had begun riding the fence line by himself, and had opinions about the land that Simon had started listening to seriously, because they were good opinions, drawn from observation and thought. He was going to be a man who worked the land the way his father did, with intelligence and long-term consideration, and Simon felt the particular satisfaction of watching a son who had arrived at himself. Colt, 14, had started working horses with a skill that surpassed accidental talent and was becoming something that could be called expertise. The Army occasionally had representatives through the territory buying horses, and Colt had been present for 3 such negotiations, and had afterward given Simon a detailed analysis of each horse's qualities and deficiencies that was more accurate than Simon's own assessment. Simon had started paying attention. Jasper, 11, had begun reading the newspaper when it came and had opinions about the political situation of the territory that were, in their earnest and slightly theatrical way, quite thoughtful. He wrote letters to the newspaper in Santa Fe. 2 had been published under his full name, Jasper Simon Crawford, which he had printed himself with visible pride and kept in his ledger journal between the pages of his stories. Henry, 6, had begun his chores. It was Delia who explained them to him, sitting at the kitchen table one morning in the spring of 1889, Henry's small face attentive across from her. She told him why each one mattered. She told him the story of the chickens and the eggs, and what happened when the routine was maintained, and what happened when it wasn't. She told him about the water and the animals and the chain of connected things that made a ranch into something alive and functional. She told him about his father's hands and his brother's contributions and how each one linked to the others. Henry listened with the complete serious attention that small children give to things that are being told to them with respect. "Is that why Jasper named the chickens?" he asked. "Partly," Delia said, "and partly because Jasper names everything. It's his way of taking care of things." "I want to name the new lamb," Henry said. "You can," she said. He thought about it for a moment with an expression of considerable deliberation. "Gerald," he said. Delia was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Where did you hear that name?" "Papa told me. He said your first water barrel was called Gerald." Something so sweet moved through Delia Brenner Crawford that she had to press her hand briefly to her chest. "Your papa's water barrel," she said. "It belonged to your grandmother." Henry considered this. "Then it's a good name," he said. "It is a very good name," she agreed. Margaret Rose, who was 2 and had been sitting on the floor removing her shoes with focused determination, looked up and said, "Gerald," with great satisfaction, and then went back to her shoes. Simon came into the kitchen to find Delia laughing at the table, Henry explaining the lamb's new name to his father with the authority of someone who has made an important decision, and Margaret Rose sitting on the floor with her shoes off and one in each hand. And he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, in the morning light of a spring day in 1889, and looked at all of it. This was what he had built. This was what had been built around him, and with him and for him, built over years of ordinary days and difficult mornings, and one woman sitting in the straw of a barn, and telling his sons why each chore mattered, and built further through 100 evenings in the lamplight and 100 mornings in the cold, and one November wedding, and one December declaration, and 2 births, and 5 years of the thing that was more durable than passion and more profound than arrangement. The thing that was simply 2 people choosing each other every day and meaning it. Delia looked up and saw him in the doorway and did what she sometimes did, which was simply to look at him directly, fully, without management or performance. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her, in front of Henry, who made a sound of protest, and Margaret Rose, who ignored it entirely. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. The summer of 1889 was one of the finest Simon could remember, the rain coming at the right intervals, the cattle doing well, the horses healthy, and the ranch operating with the smooth, purposeful functioning of a place that knew what it was for. He and Delia rode the eastern boundary together on a July morning, leaving the younger children with Emmett, who had become, at 16, a reliable guardian, and they rode in the early light over ground that was turning gold with summer and spoke of the things they were planning. They were going to expand the barn next spring. Colt had a particular horse in mind that he wanted to train and sell to a ranch in Colorado, the beginning of what he imagined as a horse-dealing operation, and Simon and Delia had been discussing whether to support this enterprise and how. Jasper had been accepted as a correspondent for a small territorial newspaper, which paid him a small amount of money, and which he took so seriously that the family had agreed to a household rule that Jasper's writing time was protected in the evenings. Henry's lamb Gerald had grown into a sheep of distinct personality, and no particular respect for fences. They rode along the eastern boundary in the morning light, and Simon said, "Are you happy, Delia?" She looked at the mesa, at the sky, at the long sweep of the land that she had been learning for 6 years, and that had become hers in the specific way that land becomes a person's, through work and attention and time. She looked at the man beside her, who had gray at his temples now and lines at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into the western light, and who was still the same man who had stood beside her without asking her to explain herself to Raymond Holt, and who had sat in the straw with her through Colt's illness, and who had held Henry on the first night of his life with the full heart of someone who had made room. "I have been happy for a long time," she said. "I am particularly happy right now." He reached over from his horse to hers, which required some adjustment of both horses, and took her hand briefly in his, and they rode in the July morning with their hands linked and the light coming up strong over the mesa and the Crawford ranch spread below them, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, the whole thing. In the autumn of 1890, Delia discovered she was expecting again. She was 35, which was not young for a third pregnancy, and the doctor offered his considered opinion that she was in good health and that the pregnancy, while requiring sensible care, showed every sign of proceeding well. She took this opinion seriously and managed herself with the pragmatic self-knowledge she brought to most things. This pregnancy ran differently than the others, the fatigue deeper, the mornings more difficult, and there were weeks in the winter when she moved at a pace that was slower than her nature preferred. Simon was attentive without being anxious, which was the exact right balance and which she understood was conscious because anxiety was his instinct and he had overridden it on her behalf. Emmett managed more of the outdoor work with a competence that came from genuine readiness, and Colt had become, at 15, essentially the third adult in the practical management of the ranch, shouldering responsibility with the matter-of-fact capability that had always been his particular gift. Jasper, who was 12 now and whose stories had become genuinely skillful, wrote a piece about the ranch that was published in the Santa Fe newspaper under the headline, "A Family on the High Desert," and which described his family with a particularity and warmth that made Delia, reading it at the kitchen table, put the newspaper down and press both hands over her face for a moment while she contained something that had no word large enough to hold it. She said afterward to Jasper, "You told our story." He looked at her with his 12-year-old serious brown eyes. "Someone should," he said. In May of 1891, another son was born. He came easier than Margaret Rose had, and when he arrived, just before noon on a Tuesday, the house was full of the ordinary sounds of the ranch day, and the extraordinary sound of a new person entering a world that already had a place made for him. They named him William, and he was, from the first, a child of robust good humor, which was perhaps exactly what the Crawford household needed at the point in time when it arrived. Henry, who was now 7, was solemn about the responsibility of being a middle child between little William and older Margaret Rose, and he took it upon himself to explain things to William with the earnestness of someone who had recently been on the receiving end of good explaining and understood its value. He would sit beside the basket where William slept and narrate events quietly, with the same cadence Delia used when she told the stories. Simon watched this and felt something so complete in his chest that it was almost painful. The chores continued. The lambs got names. The fence held. The water flowed. The filly that was now a mare grew older and slower, and remained Colt's particular love. The chickens turned over their generations, and new ones arrived who did not remember the old ones, but they were fed every morning before 8, and the eggs were collected, and the nests were kept clean, because Emmett had taught Colt, had taught Jasper, had taught Henry, who was teaching Margaret Rose, who would someday explain it to William, and each one of them had been told the story of why it mattered, and each one had carried the story forward. This was the thing about a family Delia had come to understand. It was not the grand moments, though those mattered too. It was not the crises survived or the obstacles overcome, though they were real and the surviving of them mattered. It was this, the story being told and retold, passed from person to person, each telling adding something, each telling losing nothing essential. The explanation of why the water mattered, which she had told in a barn to 3 hostile boys in June of 1883, was now part of the fabric of the Crawford Ranch, woven into how every child understood what they did and why. She had given them stories. The stories had given them themselves. On a September evening in 1892, when the light was doing what the autumn light did in New Mexico, turning everything honey-colored and specific, Delia and Simon sat on the porch together as they had sat on that porch 1,000 evenings, and the boys and Margaret Rose were inside, the older ones reading and helping and arguing with each other in the comfortable, layered way of people who know each other entirely, and little William was asleep, and the ranch was quiet in the way that good, hard-worked places are quiet at the end of a day. Simon said, "I should tell you something." She looked at him. "When you wrote to me," he said, "the first letter before you came, you wrote that you were not coming to be a ghost of what I'd lost. You were going to be useful in your own way or not at all." "I remember," she said. "I read that letter a great many times," he said. "I didn't tell you that. I put it in my coat next to the only other letter I kept close." He was quiet for a moment. "I think I knew, reading it, that something was going to change. I didn't know what." "I didn't know either," she said, "when I wrote it. I was being honest about my intentions, but I had no idea what I was walking into." "Straw," he said. "That's what you walked into," she laughed. "Straw," she agreed. "And 3 boys who were breaking my heart the moment I met them." "They were broken themselves," he said. "You put some of them back together." "Not me alone," she said. "You never stopped. You were there every day, getting up at 4 in the morning and doing what needed to be done. You didn't fall apart even when you must have wanted to." "I wanted to," he said. "I know," she said. "But you didn't." The evening settled around them, the specific piece of it, the blue of the sky going darker over the mesa, the first star appearing above the ridge. Inside, Emmett's voice, low and grown, said something that made Colt laugh, and then Jasper said something that made both of them react with the particular exasperation that Jasper's declarations routinely provoked. Margaret Rose said something decisive and small. Henry said, "Gerald got out of the south paddock again." "Gerald always gets out of the south paddock," Colt said. "That is because Gerald has no respect for boundaries," Jasper said, "which is actually quite interesting from a philosophical perspective." "It is actually quite interesting to go and put Gerald back in the paddock," Emmett said. Simon and Delia looked at each other on the porch. "Our children," she said. "Our children," he said. He put his arm around her on the bench where they sat, and she leaned into him. And outside the porch the stars were coming out above the mesa one by one, and the Crawford Ranch was full and warm and real. And this was the story, the whole of it, beginning and middle and end. Not ending in the way of things that stop, but ending in the way of things that have arrived, that have come home, that have found the shape that was always waiting for them and settled into it. Not because it was easy, but because it was true. This was what Delia Brenner had made. Not alone, and not by design, but by the accumulated choices of a woman who knew the value of sitting down in the straw and telling the story behind why each thing mattered. It had mattered. Every bit of it had mattered. And in the honey-colored autumn evening of a September in New Mexico in 1892, with her husband's arm around her and her children's voices coming through the open windows of the house she had helped to build into a home, Delia Crawford was entirely certain of this. It had all mattered. It had mattered very much.